The Pacific never was a quiet place. Even in the dawn, when the brightness of the sky was tempered and the horizon smeared to a grayish blur, there was this constant hum of movement in the ocean, this thrum of waves cresting upon other waves, this purring in the distance of engines knifing through air somewhere out of sight, this reverberation of a war always asleep but never sleeping. In this Pacific theater of World War II, distance itself was a foe to beat. Among the pilots who operated them were women. Not nurses.
Not clerks.
Not symbols for morale posters. But they are the woman pilots. Their flights began without ceremony, ended without applause, and often disappeared into classified silence. This is the story of those women, how they were recruited, why they were used, and how their work shaped a war that officially pretended they were never there. To understand why these women were needed, you have to understand the Pacific War itself. Unlike Europe, where front lines were relatively continuous, the Pacific theater was fragmented. Thousands of islands, vast stretches of open ocean, supply lines that ran for weeks instead of hours. Aircraft were lifelines, used not only to fight, but to connect isolated bases, deliver intelligence, move personnel, and test whether damaged machines could fly again. After Pearl Harbor, the United States scrambled to expand its air power. Factories worked around the clock. Training programs accelerated. Pilots were pushed through pipelines faster than ever before.
And still, it wasn't enough. Every combat mission damaged aircraft.
Some planes were destroyed outright. Others limped home riddled with bullet holes, warped wings, cracked frames, or engines running on borrowed time. These aircraft had to be moved, tested, or ferried to new bases closer to the fighting. But combat pilots were needed elsewhere. The question became uncomfortable and urgent: who would fly the planes no one wanted? Before the war, women had already proven they could fly. Figures like Jacqueline Cochran and Nancy Harkness Love were not anomalies. By the late 1930s, hundreds of women held pilot licenses. Some worked as flight instructors. Others flew air races. A few were already test pilots, jobs that required nerves of steel and a tolerance for danger. When war came, Cochran and Love pushed relentlessly for women to be allowed into military aviation roles. Their argument was simple: every man flying a non-combat mission was a man not available for combat. In 1942, the U.S. Army Air Forces agreed, partially. The Women Air Force Service Pilots, or WASP, were created to ferry aircraft, tow gunnery targets, and test repaired planes inside the United States.
They wore uniforms.
They followed military discipline. They flew nearly every type of aircraft in the American inventory. But they were not considered soldiers. They received no veteran status. No military benefits. If they died, their families were responsible for transporting the bodies home. This distinction, essential but unofficial, would become crucial in the Pacific. The Pacific theater operated under a different logic. Here, secrecy was not just about protecting plans, it was about survival. Japanese intelligence actively hunted Allied movements. Airfields were hidden. Routes were changed constantly. Some bases existed only for weeks before being abandoned or destroyed. In this environment, standard military paperwork became a liability. According to declassified records and later historical analysis, commanders began using civilian status pilots for tasks that were too risky, too deniable, or too sensitive to assign officially. Women pilots, already flying without full military recognition, fit into this gray zone. They could be deployed quietly. They could be reassigned without explanation. And if something went wrong, the consequences would be contained. This was not written policy. It was wartime improvisation. There were no recruitment posters for these missions. Women were approached quietly, often through intermediaries, sometimes through whispered recommendations. Those selected were already experienced pilots. Many had flown hundreds of hours. Some had backgrounds in test flying or long-distance ferry work. The offers were deliberately vague.
Temporary overseas assignment.
Civilian contract work.
Logistical support.
Only after arrival did the reality become clear.
Flights would be long, often solo.
Navigation would be primitive. Radios would be limited or forbidden. Aircraft might be damaged, experimental, or modified beyond standard specifications. And if they were captured, they would not be protected by the Geneva Convention. According to historical accounts, this was not always stated outright, but it was understood. Once overseas, these women entered a world that ran parallel to the official war. Some were stationed at major bases like Guadalcanal, Espiritu Santo, or New Guinea. Others operated from temporary airstrips carved out of jungle or coral. Many flights took place at night or low altitude to avoid detection. Navigation relied on dead reckoning, estimating position by speed, time, and heading. Over the Pacific, this was unforgiving. A small error could mean missing an island entirely. There were no search and rescue guarantees. If a plane went down, it was often gone forever. And because many of these missions were unofficial, there would be no record to investigate. One of the most hazardous roles assigned to these women was test flying repaired aircraft. Combat damage in the Pacific was severe. Planes landed with shredded wings, compromised frames, and engines held together by improvised repairs.
Spare parts were scarce.
Ground crews did what they could. But someone had to answer the question that mattered most: would it fly again? Test pilots were expected to push aircraft to their limits, climbing, diving, stressing airframes, to see what would fail. According to historical records, women pilots performed this work both in the United States and overseas. In the Pacific, the danger multiplied. Repair facilities were less sophisticated. Aircraft were pushed back into service quickly. There was no margin for error. Yet the work continued, because without it, the air war stalled. As the war progressed, these missions proved effective. Aircraft reached forward bases. Intelligence moved faster. Operations benefited from planes that would otherwise have been grounded indefinitely.
Success, however, came with a cost.
The more effective these women became, the more the military relied on their invisibility. Public recognition would have raised questions about their status, about the legality of their missions, about why they were placed in such danger without formal protection. So the silence continued. After the war, most records remained classified. The WASP program itself was disbanded in 1944, and its members were sent home quietly, without veteran status, without benefits. It would take decades for even their domestic service to be officially recognized. As for the women who flew covert missions in the Pacific, many of their stories never made it into archives at all. In the next part of this documentary, we follow these women deeper into the Pacific War, into specific missions, specific aircraft, and the moments where secrecy collided with survival. We'll explore how these pilots navigated enemy territory, how intelligence depended on their flights, and how close some came to being erased completely.
Because the truth is this:
the Pacific War was won not only by those whose names appear in history books, but also by those whose names were never meant to be written down. The Pacific was not forgiving of mistakes. It punished them right away, and sometimes without witnesses. By mid-1943, the war had changed.
Guadalcanal was secure.
The Allies were moving north and west, island hopping, carving out an ever-expanding front that increasingly threatened Japan itself. Every step of the way entailed an absolute reliance on air power: fighters, bombers, transports, and reconnaissance planes, and each plane depended on something much more prosaic than dogfights or bombings. It depended on logistics. And then there were the logistics in the Pacific, which required pilots who were able to fly long distances alone and unaccompanied in hostile or uncertain airspace, sometimes in aircraft that shouldn't have been flying. This was where the women entered.
Not as replacements, not as symbols,
but as tools of necessity. According to historical accounts, most of these women worked in what later came to be known as the gray space, missions which were neither completely civilian nor completely military operations. They did not wear standard insignia. They did not always fly under military call signs. They were sometimes listed as civilian contractors, sometimes as attached personnel, sometimes not listed at all. This ambiguity was intentional. If a mission succeeded, it blended seamlessly into the war effort. If it failed, it left no diplomatic or legal complications behind. One intelligence officer later described it bluntly in a post-war interview. If they got through, it was a miracle. If they didn't, it was a mystery. For many of these women, the most terrifying enemy was not Japanese fighters or anti-aircraft fire.
It was emptiness.
The Pacific theater required flights that stretched the limits of fuel endurance. Aircraft hopped from island to island, Guadalcanal to New Guinea to the Admiralties to forward bases whose names changed faster than maps could keep up. Navigation was often done by stopwatch and compass. Cloud cover could erase landmarks entirely. Storms appeared without warning. Engine trouble rarely allowed time for troubleshooting. If a pilot ditched at sea, survival depended on chance. Rescue aircraft might never know where to look. According to declassified reports, women pilots ferried aircraft such as P-39 Airacobras, P-40 Warhawks, C-47 Skitrans, and even light bombers between bases. Some flew aircraft modified for reconnaissance or testing, planes with unfamiliar handling characteristics and unpredictable behavior. Each flight carried an unspoken understanding: if something went wrong, there would be no headline. One of the most closely guarded aspects of these missions involved intelligence transport.
Radar components, intercept equipment,
aerial photographs,
encrypted documents.
Pilots were not always told what they were carrying. Often they were only told that the cargo was critical, and that delays were unacceptable. This compartmentalization was standard wartime procedure, but it took on a sharper edge here. The less a pilot knew, the safer everyone was, at least on paper. According to historians, Some women later realized that they had been carrying early radar systems or materials connected to signals intelligence efforts that helped locate Japanese shipping and aircraft movements. At the time, they were simply told to fly.
As Allied forces advanced, Japanese air and naval patrols intensified.
Reconnaissance aircraft searched for new airstrips. Submarines lurked near supply routes. Fighters waited for opportunities to ambush lone aircraft. To reduce detection, some ferry flights were conducted at low altitude, sometimes just a few hundred feet above the water. Others flew at odd hours, arriving before dawn or after sunset. This increased risk dramatically. Low-altitude flight left no margin for mechanical failure. Night flying in the Pacific, with limited instrumentation and unpredictable weather, turned even routine navigation into a test of nerves. Women pilots flying these routes had no escorts. They relied entirely on their skill and their ability to remain calm when everything suggested they should not be. One of the strangest burdens these women carried was psychological. They were doing dangerous, essential work, but could not speak about it. Not to other pilots, not to families, sometimes not even to each other.
Official silence bled into personal isolation.
Letters home were censored. Diaries were discouraged. Some women stopped writing entirely, knowing that any detail could cause problems. They learned to compartmentalize.
Fly the mission. Land the plane. Sleep. Fly again.
According to later interviews, many described a sense of unreality, a feeling that their work existed in a parallel world. They watched men receive medals for missions supported by flights no one acknowledged. They did not resent it. Resentment took energy. They needed all of that just to stay alive. Despite the secrecy, accidents happened. Planes crashed during test flights. Aircraft vanished during ferry runs. Weather swallowed planes whole. Because records were incomplete, historians cannot say with certainty how many women died during these covert Pacific missions. Some losses were absorbed into civilian accident reports. Others were never officially recorded at all. What is known is that when women pilots died, their deaths were treated differently. There were no folded flags, no military funerals,
no public recognition.
In some cases, families were told only that their daughter had been involved in an aviation accident.
Nothing more.
Not everyone was blind to what these women were doing. Some commanders quietly protected them, adjusting assignments, delaying dangerous missions when possible, ensuring the best available aircraft went to the most experienced pilots. Others saw them simply as assets. According to memoirs from male officers, reactions varied widely. Some expressed admiration, others discomfort. A few openly resented women flying missions they themselves would not accept, but all understood the reality. The Pacific War did not run on idealism. It ran on whatever worked. By late 1944, Allied air power dominated much of the Pacific. Island hopping brought bases closer to Japan. New aircraft arrived with better range and reliability. The need for these unofficial missions slowly diminished, but the secrecy remained. When the war ended abruptly in August 1945, it ended without closure for many of these women. They did not return as heroes. They returned as civilians who had been gone for a while. Some resumed flying careers. Others left aviation entirely. Many never spoke publicly about what they had done. History, once again, moved on. But the stories did not disappear. They waited. In the next part of this documentary, we examine what happened after the war, how silence became institutionalized, how recognition was denied for decades, and how historians finally began uncovering the truth behind the missions that officially never happened. The war ended quickly.
Too fast for reflection.
In August 1945, the news of Japan's surrender spread across the Pacific Ocean quicker than any plane had ever gone before. Men cheered on the flight lines.
Horns blew on ships.
Airfields reverberated with noise, relief flowing out like an artery from the tension that had become muscle memory. For many of the women who flew their missions secretly across the Pacific, however, the end of the war did not feel like the end of a chapter. It felt like an erasure. Historical accounts indicate that it did not take long for the U.S. military to spring into action as demobilization started. Units were disbanded. Contracts were cancelled. Planes were redeployed, scrapped, or flown back to the mainland. Paperwork was filed, boxed, and archived. Then quietly and intentionally began to label files about many female pilots as closed. Some records were classified. Others were mislabeled. Some simply disappeared into administrative limbo. The logic was bureaucratic, not malicious. These missions had existed in legal gray zones. Acknowledging them raised uncomfortable questions about status, liability, and precedent. So the solution was simple. Pretend they never happened. Male pilots returning from the Pacific often came home to parades, uniforms heavy with ribbons, stories already shaping themselves into legend. Women pilots returned in civilian clothes. There were no formal debriefings that celebrated their contribution.
No public commendations.
No inclusion in official victory narratives. In many cases, they were quietly thanked and quietly dismissed. One former officer later admitted in a post-war letter, declassified decades later, "We knew they'd done more than we could ever publicly admit. That made it easier to let them go." For the women themselves, the transition was abrupt. One day they were flying dangerous routes over empty ocean. The next, they were expected to resume ordinary lives.
Some tried.
Many struggled. Aviation had changed them. War had changed them. Silence hardened those changes into something heavier. Some married quickly, as if anchoring themselves might quiet the restlessness. Others chased flying jobs in civilian aviation, only to find doors closed. Airlines were not hiring women. Commercial cockpits were returning to normal. A few found work as instructors. Others drifted into unrelated careers. According to later interviews, many shared a common sensation: dislocation. They had operated at the edge of history, and then been pushed back into its margins. Despite official silence, the stories survived. They passed quietly between veterans, between mechanics and pilots, between men who had watched women take off in aircraft they themselves refused to fly. They lived in letters never mailed, in memories carefully edited for polite company, in the spaces between official accounts. Over time, these stories softened, details blurred, but the core remained. Women had flown. Women had risked their lives. Women had been erased. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, something shifted. The war generation aged. Documents were declassified. Historians began asking different questions, not just about battles, but about systems, logistics, and people who had existed outside the spotlight. Researchers stumbled onto inconsistencies, flight logs that didn't align with official rosters, maintenance records signed by unfamiliar names, photographs of women standing beside aircraft in Pacific airfields, images never intended for publication. Slowly, deliberately, the outlines of a hidden history began to emerge. Recognition did not come easily. Military institutions resisted revisiting these narratives, not out of hostility, but inertia. Acknowledging these women meant admitting that official histories were incomplete, that sacrifices had gone unrecognized, that policy had overridden truth. Some veterans themselves resisted recognition. Years of silence had become armor. As one former pilot reportedly said when contacted by a researcher, "I didn't do it for a medal, and I didn't do it to explain myself 50 years later." Eventually, pressure mounted. Journalists wrote articles. Historians published books. Surviving women, now elderly, began to speak, cautiously at first. Their accounts were restrained, factual, almost clinical. But beneath the restraint lay decades of unacknowledged weight. They spoke of flights that felt endless, of aircraft that vibrated themselves apart midair, of landings made on faith rather than fuel, and of silence, not just imposed but internalized. Recognition, when it came, was uneven. Some women received retroactive acknowledgement, others did not. Many had already died. There were ceremonies, quiet ones, applause that came too late to matter in practical terms. But history had shifted. These women were no longer invisible. Yet something essential still lingered unresolved. Because recognition does not undo erasure. It only acknowledges that it happened. In the final part of this documentary, we confront what this story ultimately means, not just for World War II history, but for how wars decide who is remembered, who is forgotten, and why silence is sometimes the most dangerous weapon of all. History favors clean lines. This, well-marked heroes, clear victories, easy conclusions. However, the truth about wars is not as clean. Wars are complex, messy, ad-libbed, and the people who exist in those spaces, who work in the quiet, who work without pomp and circumstance, are the first to get cut from the narrative afterwards. These women who carried out spy missions in the Pacific were never intended to be remembered. That was not an accident. It was This too was a design choice. As historians analyzing post-war government policies determined, the acknowledgement of these women posed questions that the military could not effectively respond to. If they were to be considered veterans, then, why were they denied rank? What were they denied benefits for? Why were these people sent on missions without proper protection? Recognition entailed responsibility. And of course, then comes accountability, which involves re-examining files that have been deliberately so. Instead, silence became the solution.
Not hostile silence, administrative silence.
The kind that feels neutral, but isn't. Every war constructs a narrative. In the American version of World War II, the Pacific theater became a story of island battles, naval clashes, and air superiority.
The spotlight fell on fighter aces, bomber crews, admirals, generals.
Logistics stayed in the background. Support roles stayed invisible. Women stayed out of frame. This was not unique to the Pacific. But the scale of the theater, and the secrecy surrounding operations there, made erasure easier. No one could point to a single mission and say, "Here. This is where she changed the war." Instead, their contributions were diffuse,
Distributed. Embedded everywhere.
which made them easy to remove. For the women themselves, silence did not mean peace. According to later psychological studies of wartime aviators, the inability to process or share traumatic experiences often intensified their effects.
Many women reported the chronic restlessness,
A difficulty adjusting to civilian life,
a persistent sense of unreality,
a tendency to downplay danger, even decades later. They had learned during the war that emotions were liabilities.
so they kept them contained.
Even after recognition campaigns began, many declined interviews. Some refused honors outright. Others attended ceremonies but spoke little. They had survived by being invisible. Visibility felt dangerous. When official acknowledgement finally arrived, it was incomplete. Some records remained sealed. Some missions could not be verified. Some names were lost forever. Recognition could not restore what had been taken. Youth spent in constant risk.
The careers denied afterward. Years of silence.
But it did something else. It forced history to admit uncertainty. The story of these women is not unique. Every war leaves behind participants who do not fit the narrative. People whose contributions were essential, but inconvenient. They operate in intelligence,
In logistics. In testing.
in support roles that lack spectacle. They are necessary,
And then they are forgotten.
The Pacific women pilots remind us that history is not just about what happened. These women did not seek glory. They did not demand recognition. They did not write memoirs filled with bravado. They flew because someone needed to fly. They accepted risk because refusing it would cost others more. They carried silence because speaking would end the work. That kind of courage does not photograph well.
It leaves no dramatic moment. No single decisive battle. It simply endures. In the Pacific, wreckage still lies beneath jungle canopies and ocean floors.
Planes that never returned. Routes that vanished. Stories that faded into static. Somewhere between those places are the women who flew through them, who trusted engines, instruments, instincts, and silence. They did not change the war by themselves.
They made it possible.
And that, perhaps, is why their story matters now. Because history is not just about who won. It is about who carried the weight quietly, and was told to forget they ever did.